I spent 15 years on the front lines of the environmental movement in the top committee of Greenpeace, which soon became the world's largest environmental activist organization. But over time, Greenpeace moved from wanting to save civilization from the destruction of nuclear war to believing humans were the enemies of the Earth. Now remember, I have a PhD in ecology. The first principle of ecology is that we are all part of the same ecosystem. But the Greenpeace message was becoming more and more full of rhetoric. I found myself the only director in Greenpeace International with an education in science. So when the group launched a campaign to ban chlorine, an element essential to public health, I had to leave. Since then, I've taken a sensible approach to environmentalism, one based on science and logic, not sensationalism, misinformation, anti-humanism, and fear. So let's talk about the science behind carbon dioxide and whether or not it's actually causing the climate to change. NASA tells us that carbon dioxide controls Earth's temperature in a childlike denial of the many other factors involved in climate change. But could this fear-mongering be self-serving for NASA? Think about it. NASA also says there might be life on Mars, decades after it was demonstrated there was no life on Mars. Could it be that NASA is just trying to keep their public funding for expeditions to the Red Planet? Maybe that's what NASA is doing with climate change. Okay, what do other organizations say? How about the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change? Unfortunately, they are totally conflicted by their own mandate. See, their brief is to focus on a change of climate which is attributed directly or indirectly to human activity that alters the composition of the atmosphere. They are not required to consider the many natural factors that affect the climate. So if the IPCC found that humans were not the main cause of climate change, or that the changes were beneficial, there would be no need for them to exist. But that doesn't stop politicians, mainstream media, and even the Pope from spreading the fear without asking any questions. Now I want to take you through some charts. They're a bit complicated, but they're important to explain what's really going on here. Let's first look at the long-term history of the Earth's temperature and CO2 in the Earth's atmosphere. I'm going to focus on the past 540 million years since modern life forms evolved. The purple line shows the CO2, and the blue line is the global temperature. So if CO2 makes the global temperature warmer, these lines should be dipping and spiking in unison with each other. But check out the Jurassic period, 150 million years ago. The temperature plummets while the CO2, the purple line, goes up. And then again, 50 million years ago during the Eocene thermal maximum, temperature was at its highest in the past 500 million years, but CO2 had been on a downward track for 100 million years. So it is not possible to demonstrate a cause and effect relationship between CO2 and temperature over the long-term history. But let's take another look at this Eocene thermal maximum and what temperature has been doing since it peaked 50 million years ago. The Earth was actually as much as 12 degrees warmer then. The entire planet, including the Arctic and Antarctica, was ice-free. Today we are actually at the tail end of a 50 million year cooling period, and yet the ancestors of every species on Earth today survived through these changes. Makes you wonder about the dire predictions of a 2-degree rise in temperature. Glaciers began to form in Antarctica 30 million years ago, and in the northern hemisphere 3 million years ago. And we're still experiencing one of the coldest climates in the Earth's history. Now let's zoom in even closer to the CO2 and temperature correlations in the Earth's history. This chart goes back over 300,000 years. That's where we start to see the strong correlation between CO2 and temperature. So maybe this is a cause and effect relationship. But here's the problem. CO2 lags temperature by an average of 800 years. So temperature changes are making the CO2 levels increase and decrease, not the other way around, as the cause never comes after the effect. This was the fundamental fraud in Al Gore's movie, as he claimed the graph proved CO2 causes the fluctuations in temperature.
It's already right here. Look how far above the natural cycle this is, and we've done that. But ladies and gentlemen, in the next 50 years, really in less than 50 years, it's going to continue to go up. When some of these children who are here are my age, here's what it's going to be in less than 50 years. You've heard of off the charts. On the temperature side, if this much on the cold side is a mile of ice over our heads, what would that much on the warm side be?
But this chart also shows something called the Milankovitch cycles. These are the cycles that are tied to the eccentricity of the Earth's orbit and its axial tilt. And as you can see, the temperatures and CO2 levels go up and down over the past 300,000 years in unison. Why does this matter? Well, just 20,000 years ago, the peak of the last major glaciation, there was 3.3 kilometers of ice on top of what is now the city of Montreal. In fact, 95% of Canada was covered in an ice sheet, and even Chicago was 900 meters under ice. The global warming that has occurred over the past 20,000 years has obviously had nothing to do with human activity. Okay, but that's 20,000 years ago. What about now? The United Nations says that it's extremely likely human emissions have been the dominant cause of global warming since the mid-20th century, so since 1950. Now let's put aside that extremely likely isn't exactly a scientific term. Scientists deal in facts, charts, numbers, and data. So let's look at another chart. Between 1910 to 1940, there was a 30-year period of warming, followed by a cooling from 1940 to 1970, just as CO2 emissions began to rise exponentially. And then from 1970 to 2000, there was another 30-year warming that was very similar in duration and temperature rise to the warming from 1910 to 1940. What caused that warming? How do they know that the causes of the warming from 1970 to 2000 weren't the same as the causes of the warming from 1910 to 1940? The logic and the data just don't add up. The data show clearly that the temperature is not rising exponentially, whereas CO2 emissions are doing so. It hasn't warmed significantly for nearly 20 years, during which time about 1/3 of all human CO2 emissions have occurred. So again, there is no obvious cause and effect relationship between CO2 and temperature rise. But still, carbon has been branded as a deadly pollutant. CO2 is the currency of life. It is the most important building block for all life on Earth. All life, including our own, is carbon-based. We shouldn't be demonizing CO2 as a pollutant. We should celebrate the carbon cycle, which is the cycle of life. CO2 is essential and must be at a certain level in the atmosphere for the survival of plants, which are the primary food for all the other species alive today. In fact, human emissions from the use of fossil fuels are promoting growth of plants around the world. Scientists in Australia, Germany, and North America confirm this. Only half of the CO2 we are emitting from fossil fuels is showing up in the atmosphere. The rest, according to the best science, is going to a global increase in trees, plants, and crops. I want to take you through this picture of how carbon is moving around. Today, at 400 parts per million carbon dioxide, there are 850 billion tons of carbon in the atmosphere. For comparison, there were 15,000 billion tons of carbon in the atmosphere when modern life forms evolved, nearly 18 times the present level. Plants and soils combined have more than 2,000 billion tons of carbon, more than twice the atmosphere. The oceans contain 38,000 billion tons of carbon, more than 45 times what the atmosphere holds. Is an increase in carbon emissions all going into the atmosphere? Well, no. It's spread throughout the atmosphere, plants, animals, soils, and the oceans. So can we all agree that carbon is not the enemy? Can we agree that it's actually the reason we are alive? And it's not making the world much warmer, if at all. But there is a trend that has me worried about the end of the world. Worried about life on this planet not surviving. Over the past 150 million years, there's actually been a steady drawing down of CO2 from the atmosphere. Let's look at the chart I showed you at the beginning again. Remember, purple is CO2, blue is temperature. Over the past 150 million years, CO2 has gone up and down, but the overall trend is down, quite a bit down. The amount of CO2 in the atmosphere went down 90% during this period. If this trend continued, CO2 would inevitably fall to levels that threaten the survival of plants, which take a minimum of 150 parts per million of CO2 to survive. If plants die, animals, insects, and all other life will die too. And this trend would not have been reversed if it weren't for humans unlocking some of the carbon stored as fossil fuels. This chart goes back 160 million years, and it shows what CO2 levels would look like if humans didn't start emitting carbon dioxide. Given the present trends of glaciations and interglacial periods, this would have occurred less than 2 million years from today, which seems like infinity to you and I, but it's a mere blink in the 3.5 billion year history of life on Earth. Think about that. Climate activists tell us CO2 is causing the Earth to warm at such a rapid pace that we have to rein in our carbon emissions, tax them even. Remember when Al Gore said this?
Scientists reported with unprecedented alarm that the North Polar ice cap is, in their words, falling off a cliff. One study estimated that it could be completely gone during summer in less than 22 years. Another new study to be presented by U.S. Navy researchers later this week warns it could happen in as little as 7 years. 7 years from now.
Well, of course, that didn't happen, because the Earth is possibly heading towards another cooling period. And human emissions of carbon dioxide are saving life on Earth from the inevitable starvation and extinction due to lack of CO2. But there's one last bit of unfinished business. Surely, as an environmentalist, I can't think that oil and gas projects like Canada's oil sands are good, right? I mean, look at them. The land is stripped bare to get the sand so oil can be removed from it. Well, when you think about it, Canada is actually cleaning up the biggest natural oil spill in history. The oil was brought to the surface when the Rocky Mountains were thrust up by the colliding Pacific Plate. When the sand is returned back to the land, 99% of the so-called toxic oil has been removed from it. And what about the anti-oil activists who say the oil sands are destroying the boreal forest of Canada? Canada's boreal forest accounts for 10% of all the world's forests, and the oil sands area is like a pimple on an elephant by comparison. By law, every square inch of land disturbed by oil sands extraction must be returned to native boreal forest. When will cities like Calgary, London, Tokyo, and New York that have laid waste to the natural environment be returned to their native ecosystems? The mining industry has well-established ecological restoration or reclamation practices. The land is recontoured, original soil is put back, and the native species of plants and trees are planted. It is actually possible, by creating depressions where the land was flat, to increase biodiversity by making ponds and lakes where wetland plants, insects, and waterfowl can become established in the reclaimed landscape. The tailings ponds where the clean sand is returned are ugly for a few years, but eventually can become grasslands. Just look at the Fort McKay First Nations herd of bison that they manage on a reclaimed tailings pond. So why would I be against the oil sands? The land is disturbed for a tiny fraction of Earth's geological time, and then it's returned to a sustainable boreal forest with clean sand. And now we can heat our homes in the winter, drive our cars to the cottage, or fly to the tropics for a vacation. So yes, as an ecologist and environmentalist, I think the oil sands are being managed responsibly. Because I don't just show people ugly pictures like Leonardo DiCaprio, Neil Young, and Robert Redford do. I make an objective study of the environmental, social, and economic factors and come to an informed judgment. It's time to set the record straight on carbon dioxide. It is not the enemy. In fact, carbon dioxide from burning fossil fuels is the stuff of life, the currency of life, and indeed the backbone of life on Earth. That's my case for CO2. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and join me next time when we'll dig deeper into how modern products and processes like fracking, natural gas, and vinyl have made life better for humankind. We separate fact from fiction when it comes to the environment. I'm Dr. Patrick Moore, the sensible environmentalist.
Today, I'm pleased to announce a team that will lead my administration's ambitious plan to address the existential threat of our time, climate change. Folks, we're in a crisis. Just like we need to be a unified nation in response to COVID-19, we need a unified national response to climate change. And from this crisis, from these crises, I should say, we need to seize the opportunity to build back and build back better than we were before.
Well, the Biden administration is rolling out a new climate agenda, including a ban on new oil and gas drilling on federal lands. And that idea fits right into California's effort to block expanded drilling across the state. But CBS reporter Natalie Brand says that plan drawing swift opposition on Capitol Hill. Hi, Natalie.
Hi, Alan. It is drawing some pushback from even members of his own party, several Democratic members from Texas. And there's already a lawsuit that's been filed by an energy industry group. But President Biden made clear today that he wants to make climate change a key focus across his administration, from national security to the economy, with an aim of growing green jobs.
Today is Climate Day at the White House.
President Biden, who's called climate change one of the top 4 pressing challenges of the time, signed executive actions making it a top priority of his administration.
It's a whole-of-government approach. Put climate change at the center of our domestic, national security, and foreign policy.
The actions include setting goals to conserve 30% of federal land and water by 2030, as well as steps to double renewable energy production from offshore winds. It also directs the Secretary of Interior to freeze new oil and natural gas leases on public lands and offshore waters to the extent possible.
We're not going to ban fracking. We'll protect jobs and grow jobs.
The oil and gas industry has been critical of the president's climate plans, with the American Petroleum Institute charging it could lead to more dependence on foreign energy and job loss. Those concerns were echoed on Capitol Hill at the confirmation hearing for Energy Secretary nominee Jennifer Granholm.
A long-term ban is going to cut revenues to New Mexico and Wyoming by hundreds of millions of dollars.
The licenses that currently are operating are not going to be disrupted.
Members of the president's climate team say their focus is on creating the jobs of the future.
We can build that demand. We can actually grow significantly millions of clean energy jobs.
On the foreign policy front, the president is planning to host a World Leaders Climate Summit on Earth Day.
And back on Capitol Hill, Senator Feinstein introduced a bill today to permanently ban oil and gas drilling in federal waters off the coasts of California, Oregon, and Washington. That proposal is co-sponsored by Senator Padilla and the Democratic senators from those two other West Coast states, Alan.
All right, Natalie Brand at the White House for us. Thanks so much.
It's a very pertinent question to ask, how do we build back better?
To build back better or whatever.
We have a chance to reset the clock and build back better than before.
To build back better than before.
Build back better.
Build back better.
Building back better.
Sometimes hearing all this stuff can feel overwhelming and you don't know what to do, but the thing is, if we come together, we can all do something. It's so important now more than ever to pay attention and to act.